Welcome, everybody. It is terrific to see you all here. And a big thank you to the Human Rights Campaign for hosting us in this really lovely space. I'm also glad that we have others joining us online for this very important discussion. Edric Huang has just finished 2 years as the David Mixner Fellow of the Institute of Current World Affairs, or ICWA, as we call it. He was based in Taiwan, examining the role of LGBTQ plus rights in the island's democracy and what the movement's discourse says about Taiwan's social and political direction. He also reported from Singapore, Nepal, and Japan. I'd like to just start by saying a couple of words about the Institute and that ICWA has advanced the understanding of global cultures and affairs for a century by providing outstanding young professionals with independent writing fellowships abroad. Fellows undergo deep cultural immersion, gaining firsthand knowledge and experience that enables them to become leading experts on international societies. Edric spent his 2 years examining how pluralistic identity politics, legal battles, and geopolitical pressures are affecting queer communities. He went on the campaign trail with parliamentary candidates. He spent time on a queer collective farm. He examined the democratic Bluebird movement and reported about transgender performers, among many other topics. Before his fellowship, Edric earned his bachelor's degree at Princeton University in anthropology and creative writing, and a master's degree in China, where he was a Schwarzman Scholar at Tsinghua University studying global affairs. So Edric will talk about some of his overarching findings and conclusions, and then he will join a stellar panel moderated by our board chair, Fabrice Udar, to broaden the discussion a little bit. And then we'll finish with a Q&A with the audience. And with that, Edric.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, just wanted to thank the Institute and, of course, Greg and Bruce for the opportunity to move to Taiwan for 2 years and have a chance to be in a place I'd actually never spent time prior to the fellowship. And so really grateful for the opportunity. Also thankful to the Human Rights Campaign and everyone here for attending today's talk. Attending a Taiwanese political rally and protest can sometimes feel like glamping. There are medical tents, childcare areas, massage parlors, tarot readings, and of course, a constant stream of drinks, snacks, wet wipes, and cooling sprays. There are Uber drivers weaving through crowds, bringing even more supplies courtesy of those who can't attend. There will always be rows of red plastic stools lined with perfect precision, and even for those standing, they will self-organize into clusters with clear walkways. You'll see banners and flags rippling in the far corners, people holding up signs and stickers printed at 7-Eleven just moments before. There are sun umbrellas decorated with slogans condemning Xi Jinping, or demonic red-eyed life-size figurines of politicians you aren't particularly fond of. You'll see cosplayers dressed up as their favorite anime characters, invoking a hero's arc, or Nymphia Wind and other drag queens. Nymphia, of course, being the first and only East Asian winner of RuPaul's Drag Race America. And in fact, look more closely and you'll see a lot more queer signage. Slogans printed on rainbow flags, memes drawing from queer subcultures like the Chinese show Empresses in the Palace, K-pop fan culture light sticks, and more. Indeed, Taiwan's culture of political participation and queer culture have been deeply intertwined over the last 10 years, even 20 years. LGBTQ people have become professional athletes when it comes to participating in street mobilization, even after same-sex marriage was legalized in 2019. This has continued to remain true, and even LGBTQ people are beginning to climb into the ranks of the political elite, with Huang entering as the first openly LGBTQ legislator in the national parliament. I think I'm repeatedly impressed by the fact that LGBTQ rights and people are held up in a place like Taiwan. And I went there questioning and wondering if its reputation as a liberal bastion remains true. And I think after 2 years, I can verifiably say that indeed, LGBTQ rights are held up within the country. But I also came to question how rights as a nation-building project can sometimes obfuscate the fault lines present in this young democracy. and also obfuscate the deep partition suspicion and seeming partisanship that's rising in the country. Taiwan lets us watch democracy define who the people are in real time. And in my presentation today, I hope to add nuance to the way that we understand Taiwan so that we don't only view it as a flashpoint in geopolitics between US and China or as a semiconductor shield, but as a place where people really persist. I think oftentimes we think of LGBTQ rights as a byproduct of democracy, but rather, I think over the course of my 2 years, it seems that LGBTQ rights can not only be a driver of a more pluralistic, inclusive way of nation building, but also an indicator of how well a democracy is performing. And so in terms of how I personally saw LGBTQ rights indicate democratic strength within Taiwan, I think of two things primarily. I think of first, the vibrant civil society that exists across the country, not only in Taipei, but across even some of the more rural areas. I saw a pride celebration happen in Yunlin, one of the most conservative and more rural backwaters part of Taiwan, reignited for the second time since Taiwan democratized in that area. And young college students organized that despite all odds. And across the last 25 years, Taiwan Tongzi Hotline Association has existed within Taiwan, offering mental health services and counseling and ensuring that Taiwanese people have a lifeline across the board. The organizations that arose during the marriage equality movement that lasted from 2012 until 2019 still exist and continue to expand the ways that they interact with civil society. The Taiwan Equality Campaign, for example, organizes on a biannual basis the Q Power Awards, which is Taiwan's answer to the GLAAD Awards. And I think seeing that and seeing just the amount of art making that's created and available within Taiwan that's rooted in queer culture indicates how easy it is to speak within Taiwan about queer identities, but also critique the government and speak openly about various subjects. I think across streaming platforms such as Gaga Ulala, which is the LGBTQ version of Netflix, created within Taiwan, curating LGBTQ content from across the world, but also in theaters with various projects that are reimagining historical trails and historical rhythms across Taiwan, but also in film. With just last month, I watched a film that was about a queer couple rooted in Taiwan's gang mafia culture. And I think the opportunity to investigate and see different parts of Taiwan through media and through art is indications of the way of how people no longer have to think about coming out as such an issue in Taiwan and how open and available it is to find resources and support. And I think the staying power of these various organizations that are taking power building through legal means, through cultural means, through political means is available across the board. But also, when I think about LGBTQ rights and its relationship with Taiwan's democracy, something that I oftentimes think about is the trauma that also came out, especially over the course of the last 10 years. 2018 is a number that, if you mention to any LGBTQ activist in Taiwan, is one laden with deep trauma. That year, the government held an open referendum in which people voted against LGBTQ rights in the form of banning LGBTQ education within schools, but then also voting against same-sex marriage. Of course, the referendum had no result on the fact that the government ultimately had to do something about same-sex marriage, legalizing it in 2019. But to see more than 2/3 of Taiwanese people vote against them left deep scars and deep ways in which the people thought about advocacy. That consequently led to even more intra-movement divisions in terms of how to approach the topic of advocacy. Should we continue to take referendums and petitions, or should we take a much quieter approach? And to this day, various of the leading organizations within Taiwan that think about LGBTQ rights continue to contest and think about these questions, leading to even deeper friction even within the movement. But consequently, when we think about the way that activism happens in Taiwan, as of last year, the Constitutional Court in Taiwan is frozen due to an amendment that was passed that led to the fact that if the Taiwanese court does not have at least 10 judges on it, it cannot operate. And because of the split legislature that exists within Taiwanese government right now, Lai Ching-te, the current president, isn't able to approve or advance any more judges onto the court. And for that reason, a lot of trans rights, a lot of rights around sexual assault can no longer advance due to the fact that this tool that originally used to pass same-sex marriage is now also frozen. Consequently, when we think about trans rights, those also exist in legal limbo within Taiwan, politicized purely versus culture wars without any regard for their rights. The Ministry of Interior's rule requiring surgery for legal gender change remains a de facto baseline even after breakthrough cases, in which 6 people were individually allowed to change their gender markers, but only those 6. And without a clear administrative fix, trans people are still litigating case by case, while political parties, as well as international actors, test anti-trans messaging. There are debates around participating in hot springs or bathrooms, while trans people are constantly forced to go to black markets in order to receive the hormones that they hope to have in Taiwan. Just last month, I talked to a now 22-year-old who, when he was 15 years old, found testosterone through a fitness trainer through a bulletin board and injected it himself because he had no other guidance, no other way in order to understand how to do that 10 years ago when there were no role models or very few conversations around trans rights. And to think about a place where we have one of the largest prides in East Asia and huge celebrations around nightlife and drag culture, and yet trans folks no longer have or still do not have the opportunity to advance themselves in proper ways. In addition to that, even though same-sex marriage was passed in 2019, there's still cross-strait exceptionalism, which undermines full equality when it comes to marriage. Since 2023, all couples, all international couples or transnational couples within Taiwan are able to marry, except for a same-sex Chinese and Taiwanese couple. And this is also propagated a lot within intra-community discourse, in which LGBTQ people still see Chinese people as spies as well, rather than seeing solidarity across other identity lines. I think in addition to this, the couples who are able to marry within China and Taiwan are able to do so if they register their marriage in a third place, such as the United States. However, this still raises questions about who can travel abroad and who possesses both the economic capital as well as the cultural capital to understand how to navigate some of these legal barriers and administrative barriers. In other words, the ability to digest so much information around legal restraints, around medical restraints, and so on and so forth is necessary to overcome numerous political and administrative obstacles just to get married. Moreover, when it comes to HIV rights and other areas such as sex work, as well as OnlyFans and BDSM work, the punitive public health and criminal just legacies exist within Taiwan. Taiwan's HIV law still criminalizes exposure and non-disclosure with incarceration, despite harm reduction successes and evolving public health norms. This signals a legal culture that can default to punishment over inclusion, which continues to be visible in tough drug statutes and the continued retention of the death penalty. And these choices shape the daily risk calculus for a lot of queer people who may still not come out in their workplaces, who may still not come out in their schools, due to the fact that there are administrators or teachers who still do not respect them. And across the board, I think there are various there's various uneven implementation of gender equity rules and laws and disputes that continue to drive a lot of the discourse within Taiwan. And so even though we do have marriage equality in Taiwan, even though we have a quite groundbreaking Gender Equity Education Act in Taiwan, a lot of this varies whether you're in Taipei or in Yunnan or in other areas within the country. And so when I think about my time in Taiwan and I think about Taiwan in general, I mention all of these learnings and these instances, not necessarily to criticize the state or think that Taiwan is not doing enough or is not far enough in the journey around LGBTQ rights and equality, but rather that when we think of Taiwan purely as a liberal bastion or as a liberal utopia, we're also precluding the opportunity to think more critically about how a state like Taiwan can continue to not only lead for itself, but also lead across the region. I think oftentimes we compare Taiwan to places such as China, such as Singapore, and other states that are more authoritarian in nature. But what does it mean to really compare Taiwan to itself and challenge Taiwan to think more about how it can continue to advance its own rights on its own terms? And so while I generally answer that Taiwan isn't a queer utopia yet, I think that's precisely why thinking more critically about Taiwan and its people really matters. The mix of constitutional liberalism, street power and action, and policy inertia makes it a bellwether for whether Asian democracies and these states can convert visibility into security without sacrificing pluralism. And I think the movement's task, when I think about it, and I continue to live in Taiwan over the next year and maybe beyond, is to move beyond exceptional wins and really think about everyday guarantees. Just as Taiwan needs to address its on-the-ground security in terms of economic policy, wage stagnation, and also geopolitical security, I think there's a lot it can do to really respect the everyday dignity of LGBTQ people across the board. And so for me, I think a lot about the dynamism that is Taiwan in terms of how people have the opportunity to speak up and have the opportunity to participate in its democracy in so many different ways. But I think also, how can we make sure that LGBTQ people across the board have that same opportunity? Thank you.
I am delighted to introduce our panelists, one of whom should be joining us remotely. I will introduce her. It is Ying Shin, who's joining us, as I said, virtually from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she's program manager for the Global LGBTQI plus Human Rights Program at the Carl Ryan Center for Human Rights at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. She works to support LGBTQI plus leaders worldwide and advocate for the dignity and well-being of LGBTQI plus people, particularly in underrepresented and under-resourced regions. And she promotes cross-sector collaborations addressing inclusion, disability rights, and mental health. Our second panelist here with us today is Mark Bromley. He is co-chair of the Council for Global Equality. He helped launch the council in 2008 to encourage a clearer and stronger American voice on international LGBT and intersex human rights concerns. In 2016, he provided the first ever testimony to the House Foreign Affairs Committee on the state of LGBT rights around the world. Today, Mark and his colleagues provide regular briefings on global trends. And our moderator, sitting in the middle, is ICWA's board chair, Fabrice Udar. In addition to running FH Consulting, Fabrice is the founder and executive director of the Association of LGBTQ plus Corporate Directors. And he's a director at Outperform LGBT Invest, and he co-founded COPPA, an LGBTQ plus economic development nonprofit. Previously, Fabrice was a senior country officer at the World Bank. Later, he was a human rights officer at the United Nations in New York, where he worked on Free and Equal, a groundbreaking UN campaign for LGBTQ plus equality. So our panelists will talk, and as I said, after the discussion, we'll finish with a Q&A here with the audience in person and take questions over Zoom if we have time. And I ask that when speaking that you please identify yourself and stick to one brief question. Thank you, and with that, Fabrice, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, and thank you to the Human Rights Campaign for hosting us. So I'll jump right into it. So Edric, you spoke about it a little bit when you mentioned the region, but it looks from an external point of view, it looks like Asia is having an LGBT moment, right? Decriminalization in Singapore, same-sex marriage in Taiwan, the endless discussion about same-sex marriage in Japan. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of whether that momentum is really existing and whether you think that it's continuing despite, the narrative that we see in the US and in China and in Russia?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I do think that there's a lot of interesting momentum happening in Asia right now. On the one hand, as you mentioned, there's decriminalization happening. That already happened in Singapore 2 years ago. In Japan right now, we're seeing a constitutional challenge to have same-sex marriage, hopefully soon. And in South Korea, we're also having the first census inclusion of LGBTQ people. And so I think there's a couple of different moments that are happening across the board. In Vietnam, they're also hoping to reignite the marriage equality movement there and also bring a lot more momentum. I think the challenge is also going to be around authoritarianism and the conservative turn that's happening in some of those countries. And so we see in Japan, their new prime minister is not particularly fond of LGBTQ rights, but has not necessarily said too much that may drive too much concern, in my opinion. But I think there's a lot of movement happening in Asia, and I think the organizations that are on the ground are doing really interesting work to really build strong support amongst the base of LGBTQ people, but also allies through their activism around families and around inclusion. And so I do think that there's a lot of positive momentum happening under the ground, and I think these organizations are working really hard despite funding cuts and so on to try to make that happen.
Thank you so much. And my dear Mark, when I came here today, when I was working with my friend Catherine, I pointed out to the Human Rights Campaign building, and I said that the LGBT worldwide government. That's not really the case anymore. The United States has taken a huge backseat on LGBT issues. And I remember Nancy Pelosi taking maybe too much credit for decriminalization in Singapore, but she definitely raised the issue when she visited Singapore, and a few weeks later, the country announced that it was decriminalizing. So do you feel, first of all, that all of the United States support for global LGBT rights is disappearing? And second of all, do you think it's going to have an impact on Asia?
Well, thank you, Fabrice, and it's really terrific to be here with some difficult questions at the moment. So obviously, with the transition to the Trump administration, we have lost a lot in terms of U.S. global leadership on human rights in general and on LGBTQI plus issues and rights particularly. The U.S., I don't want to play into U.S. exceptionalism. The U.S. is not the only leader on LGBTQI plus rights globally, but we are a consequential actor on the global stage. And in many places, in Asia in particular, U.S. embassies really played a quiet role in encouraging governments to take steps forward on LGBTQI rights in places like Japan, where Rahm Emanuel, the former U.S. ambassador, really pushed the issue. I mean, really pushed it. And if you know Rahm Emanuel's personality, you know what that means, right? In Thailand, also, the U.S. Embassy offered quiet support to the community, and I think often in ways that were a little more sensitive to politics and dynamics than maybe Nancy Pelosi was sometimes at the beginning. But I think as the LGBTQI plus human rights agenda took hold at the U.S. State Department and across U.S. embassies in the Biden administration in particular, and with the leadership, for example, of Jessica Stern, the U.S. Special Envoy for the Human Rights of LGBTQI plus persons, embassies became more astute, more sensitive to local dynamics. They worked, I think, better with local LGBTQI plus movements. They offered significant funding to the movement, both through embassy grants and through larger grants administered here out of Washington. All that is gone, right? All that is completely gone. U.S. embassies are terrified of engaging with local LGBTQI plus communities right now. They're essentially ordered not to even talk about the issue. The reporting that embassies did in the annual State Department human rights reports, they stripped out all of the reporting on LGBTQI plus rights this year, and undoubtedly, they are going to be forbidden from reporting on those issues as human rights issues going forward. So we're at a difficult moment here in terms of LGBTQI plus rights in the United States, and also the loss of global political leadership and funding from the US government. But I think that does present an opportunity for Asian governments to step up and show leadership, regionally in more profound and openly political ways. I think it's an opportunity for European governments to step up, particularly through the Equal Rights Coalition, which is a coalition of 40 governments that have come together in the world to assert a LGBTQI plus affirming human rights and development agenda. So these institutions, where the US was really in a leadership role, they have an opportunity to move forward with new leadership, with new ideas, and hopefully not so dependent on the United States, so that when eventually, I hope the United States comes back to the table, we will have broader, more diverse, more inclusive leadership at the global level.
Well, I love that. It's kind of a time for reinvention. And something that I love to say too is that Americans only represent 3%, and I'm not sure of my math, of the LGBT population. But there is one country that has a lot of LGBT people, and that's China. And so, Jean, thank you so much for joining us. It really means a lot. And, when you live in the United States, when you get news about China, it tends to not be very nuanced, and it tends to be a little bit negative. And so, as an example, a few days ago, we heard that Apple had been asked to remove all of the LGBT apps from the App Store, from the Apple Store. So my question to you is it a little more complex than that? And what is the situation of LGBTQ plus people in China? And is there any positive or hopeful signs besides what we read in the news here?
Thank you so much for this great question. And it's my honor to be part of this panel. After my colleagues sharing, I feel very hopeful. I love this energy of hope and optimistic. So I would like to share like my experience in China. So although like China's LGBT movement today is expression like significant challenging, but I do want to acknowledge the LGBT individual and organizations' urgency. So basically, in China now, the movement is experiencing like both fragmentation and resilience. So we have to admit that the space for LGBT organization has been shrinking over past 5 years. However, because of the past efforts we have made with our allies, now like in China for younger generation and for many people, their attitude, their minds and hearts toward LGBT issue has changed. And now even like globally, the setback is huge. But in China, like changing institutions of daily life remains possible, and many allies are still with us. So I would like to raise an example of a transgender medical care in China, like transgender rights in China. So in China, basically transgender people, they are able to change the gender marker on the national ID. And in 2022, actually, because like we already built a strong coalition with many transgender friendly doctors and in China. So in 2022, actually, we managed to change the surgery, the gender affirming surgery in China. So before trans people, they have to be like over 20 years old to accept the surgery. But after that policy changed, now like transgender people it's easier for them to access to that kind of surgery. And from the allyship dimension, actually, like today in China, like transgender medical care has made important like progress through stronger professional collaboration and a more comprehensive services model. Like in Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, all these kind of big cities now, like we have more transgender friendly doctors and experts. They have been working together to identify key challenges and advance the clinical practice focused on building multidisciplinary cooperation across cities, across departments. So I just want to say that although it's a very hard time, but we still have space to advance LGBT rights in China.
Well, thank you so much, Jean. And I'll continue with you. You know, our friend Mark Bromley has told us that it's time to reinvent ourselves. One of the big challenge in China is obviously the economy, right? And Chinese officials are probably concerned by youth unemployment and remaining competitive. Is there any opening in China to frame LGBT issues as being part of that economic agenda? And I know that you've worked a little bit on the mental health and wellness aspect of LGBT rights. Is that an entry point to make progress in the current context in China?
Thank you for this excellent question. Yes, like we do work on mental health in China for two reasons. So firstly, 10 years ago, actually like gay conversing therapy was an invisible topic in China. But after a decade efforts, we totally changed the landscape of the mental health industry in terms of changing the attitude of mental health practitioners. So after 10 years work with our allies, instead of providing gay conversing therapy, like now, like for most of the Chinese like psychologists or therapists, they would like to label themselves as LGBTIQ affirmative mental health practitioners. And regarding the mental health of economic opportunities, so mental health has emerged as one of the safest and the most like socially acceptable ways to advance LGBTQI issues in China. So as I mentioned that in mainstream of a mental health industry in China, like people, they would like to label themselves as LGBT friendly. And in the LGBT, within the LGBT community, like more like organizations, they would like to work on mental health issues. This is kind of from like a macro level and from individual level. We find that more and more individuals, LGBT individuals, they would like to learn about psychology. They want to be psychologists or like counselors, therapists themselves because they really want to support the community from the mental health perspective. And another thing is now in China, like mental health actually is a very huge market. So in general, working on mental health is a very safe area for advancing LGBT rights at a national level.
Well, I love that because it shows, you know, that in every context, which is a little bit what Edric was saying, in every context, it's a little nuance. You can find entry points. And to get back to you, Mark, you know, you had to describe an earthquake in a few sentences. So you couldn't delve in a lot of the details of what happened in the past 8 months. But one of the big earthquake was the disappearance of USAID and the disappearance of the Global Equality Fund. Because those two mechanisms were a huge part of how the entire movement was being funded, right? And so there is a money gap, right? Do you think that there is an opportunity? You mentioned European countries maybe picking up the mantle, right? But do you think there is also an opportunity for our movement to find different ways to fund itself, meaning not reliant on the charity of friendly governments?
Thanks for that question. That's a complicated question. At first, I think it's important to understand this money gap you're talking about. We estimate that with the loss of U.S. global investments in LGBTQI plus rights and health, as well as the loss of the Global Equality Fund, which was a pooled fund that many governments put money into but was run out of the State Department, and that provided incentives and oversight to encourage other governments to put money into that pool. So with the loss of all of that, the total loss of U.S. funding, the loss of significant European funding because the money that was going into the Global Equality Fund is now lost or in limbo at the very best. We believe that well over half of all global funding for LGBTQI plus rights is gone. And when you add in the cuts to our global HIV program through PEPFAR, it's massive. We're talking 70, 80% cut in global funding for local LGBTQI plus groups and activism. Luckily, I think the landscape in Asia is perhaps a bit better, but it's devastating in many parts of the world, particularly in Africa right now. So how do we get back? I do think there are some discussions around innovative new opportunities for funding. There's a lot more interest out of necessity in sort of entrepreneurial exercises where local LGBTQI groups can provide goods or services or travel support or whatever it may be to actually raise their own funds. I think that's super important and exciting. I think it's going to be a long time before we see those sorts of small social enterprise efforts become self-sustaining for a large number of LGBTQI plus people or groups. But it's incredibly important, and it has to be part of the solution. I also think we have to challenge other governments, particularly those in the Equal Rights Coalition, which was set up to coordinate development assistance for LGBTQI plus groups around the world. We have to challenge them to step up. And those of us engaging with the Equal Rights Coalition have actually set a goal of asking all governments that are in that coalition that profess their commitment to inclusive development to allocate at least 0.03% of their total development assistance to global LGBTQI plus rights. That's not 3%, that's 0.03%, right? Right now, we're nowhere near that. The only country that's ever come close is the Netherlands, and that was when they had one really big one-off investment in a global project. So no country has come close at a sustained level, but it is, we believe, an attainable step toward inclusive financing for the community. So I think ultimately we have to return to government financing. We also need to crack the World Bank, where you spend a lot of your time trying to promote inclusive development. The Asian Development Bank has taken some important steps toward LGBTQI plus inclusive financing, particularly with the leadership of the past US ambassador to the Asian Development Bank, who was an open lesbian, our first ever US lesbian ambassador, Huang, who really kind of led the effort to promote inclusive development at the Asian Development Bank. That is moving forward, as I understand it. The Chinese are not terribly happy with that agenda, and the Japanese have been kind of on the sidelines, but it is moving forward. And I think those sorts of inclusive investments through the Asian Development Bank, through the World Bank, have got to be a part of the solution as well. So I think we have to get back to bilateral government funding, at least at 0.03% of development assistance. We need to really integrate funding into the international financial institutions, and we need to promote long-term these sorts of social enterprise efforts so that we can be more self-sufficient, and at least more self-sufficient during cycles like this where government funds disappear for political or economic reasons.
When I was listening to you, and you were mentioning the international financial institution, I was thinking what a blessing that the head of Treasury happens to be a gay man. On that note, I'll move to my
which just shows that gay people are not always the biggest champions of inclusion.
So now switching to my friend Edric. Edric, you spoke a lot about progress around human rights in Taiwan, and how nuanced it is, and how we need to be careful when we paint too broad of brushes on a country. What about the economic side of things? When you were in Taiwan, did you observe that LGBT people were doing well economically, and also that they were leveraging their economic power to contribute to achieving the goals you described earlier?
Yeah, I think to the first part of the question, in terms of, I think class divisions are quite apparent in the LGBT community in Taiwan. And I think a lot of that is derivative of kind of the cultural elements and the familial elements. I think a lot of people, when they don't have the support available to them, they're forced to go into service industries, or they're forced to go into certain areas of certain sectors where there is not a lot of wage growth, there's not a lot of opportunity. And so I think across the board, I think disparities within Taiwan is quite apparent across the board. I think especially within LGBTQ communities, especially amongst trans communities, I would say. There's not a lot of opportunities for them, if not at international companies or to go into tech, for example. But I think in terms of kind of strategies, one thing that Taiwan, I think, is trying to do quite well is kind of center tourism and center that industry within LGBTQ hands a little bit more. There are various associations that are focused on LGBTQ tourism, particularly in the South, that are trying to really drive a lot more attention to cities like Kaohsiung and also to Taipei, that are owned by, for example, there are LGBTQ-owned hostels, hotels, services, tour companies, and so on and so forth. And so there are small ways that are sector-specific that I think folks are trying to build little bit more power and make sure that money stays within the hands of LGBTQ people. I think one instance that comes up in terms of economic power outside of Taiwan is in Japan. Tokyo Rainbow Pride has been sponsored by Cheerio, which is a Japanese company, which has also led kind of a larger coalition of Japanese companies and international companies to join hands in sponsoring Tokyo Rainbow Pride for the last 12 years, I believe. And it continues to do so and is currently thinking about expanding their sponsorship to other local prides across Japan. And Cheerio is owned by a straight man and has made the business case for more LGBTQ inclusion within their company, but also across the board with other companies such as Coca-Cola and so on and so forth. And so I think that they're an interesting case where they're not LGBTQ-led, and yet they really understand why it's important to think about allyship within that economic case. And I think in other areas, I think there's kind of growing attention around just like co-op models and also other kind of economic inclusion models that are focused on sharing resources as much as possible, both from like a grassroots perspective and then also from like a business perspective. I mean, the cooperative farm that Greg mentioned that I visited a little bit earlier, they themselves, they're a cooperative initially of lesbian women, and now it's just women in general who own a rice farm and as well as a fruit farm out on the east coast of Taiwan. And they are in a community of new farmers. And new farmers are generally discriminated against within Taiwan economically because they don't own their land. They're typically renting their land from older families who no longer have children or younger folk to manage the farmland. And so because they don't own the farmland themselves, they have no ability to participate in farmers associations and can't do much to advocate for their own rights. And so in that instance, a lot of these new farmers tend to come together, and a lot of them are younger and queer and or women, and are pooling resources in order to sustain their businesses as long as possible so that the land doesn't just get converted into B&Bs or into speculative land ownership. And so I think there are small models like that are happening across in Taiwan and Japan and other places that I visited. But I would say that the best cases that I saw were the Japanese case. And in Singapore, I think a lot of the money comes from elders who, now that there is decriminalization, they are finding a lot more comfort in the ability to participate in philanthropy and fundraising, and have even opened, an LGBTQ center in Singapore, and have a transgender shelter funded in Singapore, which is the first of its kind. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot more attention around like how do we leverage business and individual philanthropy more strongly within a lot of these countries.
And out of curiosity, what does Cheerio do? What is
Cheerio is a beverage company. Yeah, they have vending machines all around Japan that sell various kinds of beverages, and a lot of their beverages are LGBTQ branded as well during Pride and around. They're not as big as Coca-Cola or anything, but I think that the third largest beverage company. Looking at folks who also know them, but
we drink a lot of soda, gay people. Now turning to Jean, and then I will open to Q&A. A question I had for you is that U.S. organization can learn a lot from civil society organizations that have been in more difficult context. There is an approach of Chinese civil society which is non-confrontational, right? Meaning that in a way civil society in China is kind of adapting to a context that is not always very supportive. Would you talk a little bit to us about what a non-confrontational approach can look like, and whether, frankly, there is anything that American civil society organization can learn from their Chinese counterparts?
Thank you for this amazing question. So, because in the context of China, the non-confrontational strategy for us is the most effective one, and I would like to share. That according to a professor called Erica Chenoweth's research, actually like a non-violent and a non-confrontational approach often yield more sustainable change than violent approaches. So in China, because we have never had an environment that allowed us to protest or do all kinds of campaigns, try multiple strategy to achieve our goals to advance LGBT rights. So basically, the most powerful strategy for us is to work with professionals from different fields to gain this kind of collective power for the community. So as I mentioned before, in China, to achieve national policy levels, advocacy is difficult, but organizations will often focus on transforming institutions of daily life, such as we work in workplaces, hospitals, universities, service industries. For example, although in China, LGBT organization, we cannot register as a real NGO. So sometimes we register as business, or sometimes we just work as a very small group. But usually we work with our allies. For example, we managed to work with domestic foundations, international organizations to do our campaign. Like there is an organization, they focus on anti-bully for LGBT students on campus. Although it's very hard for them to operate as LGBT organization, but usually they work with organizations focused on education to create space to maintain their work. So basically, that's our strategy. We kind of leverage the resources, limited resources, through build a strong coalition with our allies. And this kind of approach allows us to make change without triggering political confrontation.
Thank you so much, Jean. So if we lose our 501c3 status, we know what to do. Thank you. Now I'm going to ask for questions, and if there are no questions, I'll pick volunteers. Please, Mr. Feder.
From a distance, of the closer? Oh no, you're still there. Okay. From a distance, it seems like there's potentially a parallelism between the dynamic of the queer movements in Taiwan and China and Ukraine and Russia, in the sense that in Ukraine, for example, the movement has been very successful in attaching itself to a kind of, maybe you could call it like a democratic nationalism. And some of the points that you were making, Edric, about the way that queer rights are a bellwether for democracy's health in general, that's been very effective there. And the contrast with Russia, with this crackdown, has been even more accelerating for that success. And conversely, in Russia, the crackdown on queer rights didn't start initially from a kind of homophobic or transphobic impulse per se, but rather a strategic way to attack civil society that was perceived as advancing democratic goals. And on the international stage, it's sort of challenging human rights norms, democratic norms. It seems like in Russia, that's recently taken a very extreme turn towards really being genuinely motivated by homophobia and being much more persecutorial. So I guess the question, Edric, I'd be curious to hear from you about that kind of democratic nationalism framework. And then, Gina, I'm wondering, are you at all concerned that the escalation that we've seen in Russia, going from a kind of a political attack on queer rights, or attack on queer politics, I guess you could say, could shift into being much more of a cultural impulse with things like the app ban that Fabrice just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of I think that the LGBTQ project within Taiwan is very much a nationalist project. I think in a lot of ways, when same-sex marriage was passed by Tsai Ing-wen and that administration, it was a huge move because it meant that it was a way for Taiwan to distinguish itself more clearly from China. And so since then, I would say especially the status of Taiwan, I think whenever you hear about Taiwan as this bastion of human rights, a lot of that is more so rooted in LGBTQ rights than probably anything else. Around the Me Too movement, that was, I would say, probably more of a big failure in Taiwan than anything. And I would say women's rights outside of political participation is sometimes questionable in Taiwan. Maybe I'm a little bit more critical these days. But I think that there's a lot of pride in Taiwan because of the fact that LGBTQ rights are so advanced there. And I think that a lot of political participation within the community is rooted in that idea as well. I think that when you kind of take a step outside of the LGBT community, it could go either way. I think public support for marriage equality has actually slowly decreased in the last year within Taiwan. Originally, it was, I think, 67% in 2024. It's at 64% 2025. And part of that, I think, is because I think there's a little bit more of a conservative turn happening within Taiwan, and also a lot of transphobic voices that are definitely increasing within the country. And so I think there's an open question around kind of like how it continues in kind of a similar manner, I think, around Ukraine, where how do we think about the future of this movement and sustainability over time, I think is a question that the movement has on its mind very much. But for now, and I think that, you know, the international presence at Pride, I think the amount of people who understand Taiwan and put it on the map because of LGBTQ rights is quite prominent. But I think one thing just about China before I hand it off to Ying as well, I think that it's really incredible, I think, what Chinese people are able to do under the circumstances that they have been able to do it. You know, one story that always comes to mind is at the Queer Film Festival that happens in Beijing. There's one year where they had to operate it on a train because they couldn't find a physical venue in Beijing to do it. And the fact that it was just running on a train throughout China over the course of time is kind of an incredible instance in which people are sustaining something through their resilience. And I think in Taiwan, there's so many instances of that as well. But I think that the pressure, I think, of an authoritarian government causes people to be creative in a way that I think sometimes in Taiwan, within the community even, there can sometimes be complacency because we've achieved marriage equality, we've achieved this great success. And I think the clear question of like what's next for an entire community hasn't been so clearly defined yet, that I think leaves openings for those TERF and transphobic voices and so on to kind of enter in. But yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Yin, what about this comparison with Russia? Do you think about Russia ever?
That's a very tough question. Actually, yes. But I feel like LGBT activists in China, we face different challenges from our folks, our like counterparts in Russia. I feel like at least we still have like more spaces, and we kind of like we have more safety to live as LGBT individual in China. So I'm not so like pessimistic towards the LGBTIQ activism in China. As I mentioned before, I really value and I want to highlight the urgency of LGBT individuals and organizations in China. As Edric mentioned that although like we are facing the challenge, but we are kind of creative, like we still manage to make change. But I want to raise one point is I feel like at this moment, for the global South LGBT activists, we have to think about how we can address the backlash, especially those backlash rooted in the myths toward LGBT people. For example, the biggest challenge for activists in China is LGBTIQ issue and women's rights issue always be considered as a Western ideology. And this is not just ours, like some folks in other countries, they also have this challenge. But how we can address this topic, right? And I also want to mention that I feel like over the past decades, lots of resources have been to like marriage equality, but we barely have enough resources to address like economic empowerment for LGBT people and like mental health for LGBT people. So I feel like at this moment we really have to make efforts to have this kind of strategy to reshape the LGBT activism ecosystem at a global level. We need to broaden participation beyond activists to bridge policymakers, scholars, and researchers, economists, educators and the private sector partners, international, regional institutions, and grassroots leaders. So we can ensure that LGBTQI issues are embedded in economic development, public health, education, and cultural change, not just within the human rights, but we can also advance LGBT people's living situation beyond the human rights framework.
That's music to my ears again. Mr. Pfeiffer?
My question is, well, first of all, terrific talk, terrific discussion, fascinating to hear. And I have a question for Edric, and that is, can you describe sort of a concrete instance, episode, sort of something that happened to you during your 2 years in Taiwan that gave you the most hope for the state and future of LGBTQ rights, and what that says about the state of the island's democracy? And with apologies for putting you on the spot, can you describe an incident briefly, something that happened to you that was the most disappointing?
Yeah. I think one instance that was particularly, I think I tried to focus a lot on hope in a lot of my dispatches, I think, because I wanted to create as positive an instance of an example of the country at a time when I think more hope is useful. One is, I think, the Yunlin Pride story that I mentioned earlier. So Yunlin being one of that really conservative, rural backwater part of Taiwan. In that area, there is essentially no funding at all to do any kind of LGBTQ work. There is no official LGBTQ organization there. And I think the rural parts of Taiwan, I think, feel akin to China or to Singapore, where it's really difficult to register an LGBTQ organization and do that kind of work because of public backlash. And because a lot of people will not be interested in kind of having that kind of organization be near them. And a lot of the people in those counties want to reverse marriage equality. They actually, politicians constantly campaign in those areas to get rid of it, and they win based on those kinds of campaigns. And so when I was there, there was a group of essentially college students and young grad students, 22, 23, 24 years old, who, against all odds in terms of resistance from the public health department, resistance from kind of the traffic kind of departments and people who are managing the streets to give them a permit in order to even host a pride, they were able to find that space and kind of like carve out enough funding from other sources. And I think this is perhaps towards something that Mark was mentioning earlier about finding funding from other movements or finding funding from corollary activists and supporters. And we're able to pull together a pride that had, I think, about 6,000 participants in total, and had people march through kind of the main thoroughways of the capital city of that particular county. I think why it gave me so much hope was the fact that even though we hear so much about Taipei, to hear something like that happen in such a conservative part within Taiwan is so rare. To hear even in Taiwanese media, I mean, no other Taiwanese media for the most part reported on that pride, other than me and maybe like one local network. And I think to see people really come together and like want to support that county, also from other counties within Taiwan, was really inspiring, because I think that oftentimes people are so busy because the economic situation in Taiwan is like not the greatest. There's a lot of wage stagnation. Rent is quite high, especially in the biggest cities. And so you don't really oftentimes see that kind of coming together. But I think to have that event happen at all was quite inspiring to see that. And also to see it happen from young people. I think there's a lot of discourse around will young people still participate in social movements because of online culture, because of kind of a lot of people are starting to move abroad and kind of like look away from Taiwan for economic opportunity because of the looming China question and because of this economic stagnation. And so I think to turn to a part that most people forget in Taiwan and to really remember it, I think is quite inspiring in a lot of ways. In terms of disappointing, I think for me, I think the HIV question is one that oftentimes comes up a lot. In Taiwan, you can be sent to prison for up to 10 years if you don't disclose your HIV status proactively and infect someone or pass the virus onto someone. And so that's a law that is present in South Korea, some other parts of the world. But it's one of those things that I think for me, when I think about Taiwan as a democracy, it's something that raises a question mark around why are we kind of having a punitive reflex to something as opposed to a rights-oriented reflex. And there have been, that law has been used multiple times over the last few years to criminalize folks for the HIV status. And I think it also causes a lot of people to not disclose, to not get tested, to not speak up about HIV at all. And even within the community, whether it's on Grindr, or whether it's on other platforms, even in real life, there's very, very little discourse. And I think that the way that HIV is talked about in Taiwan is still very much kind of a discourse around HIV from the 1980s. In a lot of ways, where it's perceived with a lot of stigma, it's perceived as something that you do not want to touch. And I think that hearing stories from friends who are HIV positive and artists who are making work around that, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of disappointment stories in just how little change has happened within that particular space of the LGBTQ community. And I would say there's a lot of other pockets like that, such as around sex work and so on.
Thank you, Edric. We are a little bit over time, but which is not very Japanese, but I'll take one more question from the gentleman.
I'd like to flip the China question, if we could call it that, the China question back to Taiwan. There's certainly no end of reports in the press here about the Chinese threat, Chinese design, saber rattling, whatever you want to call it. What does the LGBTQ community in Taiwan tell you about that? About China and the geopolitical. Are they concerned? Does it come up? Does it the way it comes up so much here?
I think the question of if it comes up as much as it comes up here, I think ultimately in everyday life, not as much within the LGBT community or in general. Of course, like I want to caveat that by saying that there are a lot of civil defenses organizations that are rising. There are a lot of efforts to kind of train Taiwanese people to understand like what could happen and what should they do in an instance in which there might be an invasion or there might be action happening on the island. And I think that there is concern within certain sectors of the community. I think if you take politics as one, for example, I will call this gossip because I don't want to say this is from like any particular source of mine. But I think there are concerns within Taiwan, especially within the political sphere, of whether there will be another general election, for example, in Taiwan, if something were to happen before 2028. And a lot of those concerns come from kind of like a lack of accountability from certain political actors that may be particularly pro-China aligned around the way that they're acting and the way that they're instituting certain policies that don't feel like they're accountable to the communities that are located on the island. And so there are concerns, I think, particularly when you think about geopolitics and think about kind of the elite within the island. But I think on an everyday level, if you look at kind of the stats around identity on the island, I think the current stat is less than 10% of people identify as Chinese when they think about their cultural identity on Taiwan. And the majority of people either identify as Chinese or as both. And I think what that tells you is that a lot of people have a deep kind of pride and attention on Taiwan and the affairs that are on Taiwan. And because the economic situation in Taiwan is probably what's on most people's minds in terms of economic opportunity, job opportunity, wage, and so on and so forth, I think everyone's everyday concerns tends to be a little bit more focused on that because the China question has been on people's minds for so long that it becomes not invisible in the sense that you don't think about it at all, but more so it just becomes a facet of everyday life. And so you hear news about drones, you hear news about military exercises, you hear news about these other events that are happening in the cross straits, but they don't present as kind of apocalyptic or as something that might happen tomorrow because it's been tomorrow for 30 years. And so I think that it depends on who you ask, I think, more than anything. And I think that people are persisting and building life in spite of kind of the ongoing news.
Well, I apologize to putting an end to this conversation, but you can grill Edric in the coming days without any problem. He's at your disposal. On this note, Thank you so much, Yin, for joining us. Really appreciated. Thank you, Mark, for coming and delivering all those bad news about the United States. And thank you so much, Edric, for coming here and talking about your experience.
Thank you all for a fascinating discussion. Seconding Fabrice about that, really fascinating. Thanks to everybody on our panel for joining. Thanks to you all in the audience for coming and for joining us online. And also very big thanks to the Human Rights Campaign for hosting us in this wonderful space. You can read Edric's dispatches online on our website, www.icwa.org. And I hope you join us for future events. Thank you.